Okay, this is going to be a two-part video going over the current state of healing in general in 10.2 or Season 3, and then I'll also be going over the individual state of different healing specializations, mostly what I've been playing for the past 3 weeks, and all of this is going to be from the perspective of Mythic Plus, ranging from anywhere between like level 10 to level 24 keys. So the way I see it, the whole 10.2 fiasco kicked off with this blue post, this healing manifesto, effectively outlining Blizzard's aims or their plans for 10.2, what they wanted to do with healing in general. Now, most of this pertains to Raid, but this was a global approach to adjusting healers in all parts of the game. Blizzard wanted to increase the power of, or the throughput of single target healing spells. They wanted to curtail the power of group healing spells in an attempt to ensure that people stay injured for longer and that healers can't just push a button or maybe two buttons or something and instantly top a group of people from injured or near death or something back to full health. And lastly, they wanted to make mana something more that all healers manage. They wanted mana to feel like a finite resource, and they wanted the ways to generate mana to still feel relevant, but they wanted spell selection to play a large part in mana management. Now this might sound a little bit counterintuitive because my contention here is that I think Blizzard have failed on pretty much 3 of those 3 points. The single target healing I'll get to in a little bit. That they've actually, I think this was largely a success. There are a couple of healers this kind of fell flat for, but by and large most healers feel better in this regard. So that is a pseudo win or half win, I guess, but the other 2 points definitely Blizzard have failed on, in my estimation. But having said that, I think healing is in a better state in 10.2 than it was in Season 2. Firstly, I'll tackle the last point, mana generation or mana management. I think Blizzard failed on this part because at the moment, in keys at least, healers feel like they fall into one of 3 categories. They either don't worry about mana at all, and they can press any spell they want as often as they want and disregard mana completely, which is what Mistweaver, Discipline Priest, and in some cases Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker feel like. The latter 2, you have to play in certain ways or drop certain talents for your mana efficiency, but definitely for the sake of Mistweaver, and in my opinion Discipline. I know some discs can have some trouble with mana depending on how they play and how much haste they stack, but from my play, Mistweaver and Discipline fall into this category. They don't worry about mana at all. The second category is healers that give up a significant part of their toolkit. There are some abilities that cost too much mana that are too prohibitive, so they just don't press them ever, but once they stop pressing them, they become extremely mana efficient. Preservation Evoker is a good example of this. If you don't press Temporal Anomaly, you pretty much cannot go Sorry, I should amend that to if you don't press Temporal Anomaly or Emerald Blossom, or you only press Emerald Blossom when you have an Essence Burst proc. But I mean, for the sake of Mythic Plus, most Preservation Evokers don't press Blossom at all. So they become this weird spec that if they don't press TA, they have infinite mana. If they press TA, they run no matter what they do. Holy Paladin at the moment also falls into this category, which doesn't sound as bad as the reality of the situation. Holy Paladins, if the only buttons you press is Holy Shock and use your Infusion of Light procs on your free buffed Flash of Light, which you talent for, and maybe you only press Hammer of Wrath when you want the Holy Power generation, or to heal with Veneration, Holy Paladin again becomes a spec that just doesn't spend mana, but if you press any of your other buttons, you run Resto Druid also falls into this category. If you rely almost entirely on Life Bloom, your Grove Guardians, and your 2 and 4 piece bonuses to heal, you can do crazy amounts of healing and really not spend mana at all. It's only when you start spamming rejuves and non-clear-casted regrowths and pressing Wild Growth on cooldown, dropping F-Flow every 10 feet or something, that's when Resto starts running out of mana. And then the third and final category is specializations that go no matter what they do. Restoration Shaman and Holy Priest, in my opinion, are in this category. I wouldn't say their mana is that bad, but I also wouldn't say they manage their mana. They're just on a timer. Now, I think all three of those outcomes are a design failure. Mana and its management should be an impactful part of healing, but that balance or that dance should come from spec design, spell selection, and making decisions as a player. And I think that comes from expansive toolkits, having the ability to use different skills with different mana costs to heal in different situations. A good example of this would be Resto Shamans at the moment, with spells like Healing Wave and Healing Surge. One of them is supposed to be the emergency heal that costs a lot of mana, and the other one is supposed to be the slower and more efficient heal, but unfortunately at the moment Resto Shamans feel like they run no matter which of those spells you choose. I think probably one of the biggest indictments of the current mana situation, at least so far in Season 3, is that anyone who has played both a Mistweaver and a Holy Paladin knows that that's not balanced. That's not a good state of affairs. One healer can press any button they want, whenever they want, however many times they want, and not really ever have to worry about mana at all. And then the other one will run by just trying to do damage. As far as the AoE group throughput kind of situation goes, this point, the group healing spells that are too rapidly or were too rapidly increasing raid or a party from a damage state to a full health state, I think this has also failed. I mean, looking at basically any half-decent log right now, in Mythic Raid especially, most healers are running already in week 3 of the raid. They're already overhealing 50% or more. This is the exact problem that Blizzard ostensibly tried to fix, but failed to do so. Overhealing, instantly topping groups, healers sniping each other, and groups going from effectively full health to almost dead to back to full health extremely quickly is still the norm. Especially in Raid, still true in Mythic Plus, but there is a little bit of variance here. Some healers definitely do this much better than others, and I would also say that at the moment, the healers that do this the best, the healers that have avoided Blizzard's attempt to curtail group AoE throughput, are the healers that feel the best to play at the moment. Mistweaver, Discipline Priest, Resto Druid, all healers that have no problem at all constantly and quickly topping a group back to full health. Now, where Blizzard did somewhat okay was the single target healing spells that back in Season 2 felt like they weren't powerful enough. For some healers at least, the 30 to 40% buffs that Blizzard kind of threw at every healer have felt quite impactful, and in keys, in many cases, they feel great. Mistweaver, in particular, single target healing feels great. Preservation Evoker, little bit of setup, but can also feel good. Unfortunately, most of the other healers feel a little lacking. Resto Druid actually is quite good, but Holy Priest, Discipline Priest, Resto Shaman, Holy Paladin, their single target healing is definitely better than it was, but it isn't in the same league as, let's say, Resto Druid and Mistweaver. So I think Blizzard have done a good job of making single target healing feeling more impactful, but more so for some healers rather than others. Now, as far as healing overall feels in 10.2 in keys, funnily enough, I think it's in a much better state than it was last season. Now, I disagreed with this whole manifesto with what Blizzard outlined as their intent for 10.2 changes, but they missed the mark so badly in many cases that the current season is feeling good to me. The big caveat here is that I've been focusing my playtime on playing healers that feel the best right now. I'm lucky in that they are healers I've been playing for a long time, and they're the ones I enjoy. Mistweaver, Discipline, Preservation. So take my praise with a grain of salt, I guess. If I was playing maybe only Holy Paladin, Holy Priest, I'd probably hate the current season. Moving on to the second part of the video, which is the state of specific healer specializations. I'm going to be going over the 3 specs mostly that I've been focusing on in Season 3, which is Discipline Priest, Preservation Evoker, and Mistweaver. And I'll start with the one that feels like the best for me, the most fun, and that is Mistweaver. Mistweaver at the moment feels a little bit like the post-reworked Holy Paladin, in the sense that the spec got a few, I guess you could call them minor changes. but they have added up to making the spec feel like it's almost been fully reworked. If you haven't played Mistweaver ever or in a long time, I'd recommend giving it a try now. Since Legion, I've been saying that the Hellfire Citadel version of Mistweaver Monk with the old Extend Life tier set bonus from Warlords of Draenor was the most enjoyable, most fun spec the game's ever had. But now I think in 10.2, the current version of Mistweaver is even better than that. I think it's definitely in the best state it's ever been in, and it's probably one of the most fun healing specializations or versions of a healing spec that the game's ever had. I think Blizzard have been aiming for this since the Legion rework for Mistweaver, but since then the spec has felt a little bit clunky, a little unfinished. It's felt like it's had one foot in the fist weaving side and one foot in the casting side, but Blizzard have never quite been able to meld or mesh those styles together in a way that lives up to the name of mist weaving. Now I think it has. And like I said, it's a bunch of changes that might not seem like much on paper, but I think you add them all together and they really make Mistweaver feel fantastic right now. And this goes back to even some of the talent changes and the ancient teaching split healing change that happened, I think, in 10.1.5 or 0.7, along with the range buff on ancient teachings healing, the expel harm buff we got in 10.2, the blackout kick stacking up to 4 charges change, the talent point adjustments, a few nodes being reduced from 2 points to 1 point, which allows us to take the Phalanx Stomp nodes, the Shaylin's Gift nodes, Ancient Teachings, and Rising Mists all together at the same time. And it feels like a complete spec. A well thought out, well formulated, enjoyable spec to play. This has been one of my major criticisms of Mistweaver, at least for Dragonflight. It felt like the spec wasn't played or really cared about by the developers, but 10.2 has turned me around on that entirely. And not just because of their numerical power, because they are quite strong at the moment, but the way that the spec has been streamlined. Small things like adding Expel Harm as a really good, reliable self-heal. Even adding the choice node of Diffuse Magic and the Yulon's passive stacking magic damage heal shield thing. Those kind of small changes that have been happening now for a couple of months, along with the instant Vivify buff being actually properly fixed for the first time in the entire expansion. For the previous seasons, it's always worked in that if you were casting a Vivify as you gained the buff, the cast of Vivify when it finished would eat the buff but wouldn't give you the bonus of the buff. And now that's been fixed. So now you can cast a Vivify, gain the buff while casting, and it doesn't eat the buff, and then you have an instant cast Vivify waiting for you when you finish the cast. Small things like that really make the spec feel polished, finished, played by Blizzard, like someone cares to make the things work the way they're supposed to work. As far as the playstyle itself and fun goes, Mistweaver is S tier for me right now. I'm not talking about S tier power, even though it is really good, just talking about how well the spec flows together now, how it really does feel like I am weaving caster spells in with melee abilities. My talents and buffs work the way that they're supposed to. I have multiple strong and good talent builds I can use and work around, and cooldowns to use. The spec feels great, so credit where credit is due. Thank you to Blizzard on that one. Next up is Discipline. Discipline also got a rework back in Legion, and since then, Discipline to me has had Atonement healing or the Atonement mechanic as the core of its identity, and it's always been something that has been balanced for and works well in Raid, but never quite could stand on its own 2 feet in keys. 10.2 has fixed that. The 50% buff to Atonement healing outside of raids has made the spec feel really good to play, in the sense that I can get through almost all of the content in keys and healing patterns required and things like that, even cooldown healing moments, by just Atonement healing. And that is incredibly good. That's fun. That's what the spec is supposed to be, in my opinion. There are, however, 2 problems. First, It feels like almost all of the healing power the spec has is currently tied to Mindbender or Shadow Fiend. The difference between having for almost everyone, it's going to be Mindbender is the go-to talent, but the difference between having Mindbender up at the moment and not having it up is enormous. The saving grace here is that the current 4-piece and the gear levels we can get to, the haste levels we can get to, allows for Mindbender to be up pretty much all the time, or very close to all the time. At the very least, you can have Mindbender up every pack. If the pack lives a long time, probably multiple times during one pack or one boss fight in a key. It's up extremely often. I don't think this is particularly healthy for the game or spec, because if the uptime of Mindbender gets nerfed, Disc is going to feel like it's been kicked in the teeth. It's going to feel horrible. The second problem, as I see it, is that the spec is monumentally boring right now, unfortunately. Now, this ties into a couple of things. This goes into Discipline and Holy Priest not having a kick, not having good mobility, not having good utility, and now they have a healing rotation that is effectively a damage rotation in almost all situations, and it's only a couple of buttons. It has almost no depth or complexity to it, and it effectively plays the same way all the time. This is all a result of the 10.2 passive changes, or the talent tree changes that Blizzard made. They took the axe to a couple of talents and turned them into passives in an attempt to make Disc feel like it had a little bit less button bloat. They certainly achieved that. Unfortunately, it feels like it's gone a little bit too far, increasing the cooldown of Mind Blast from 9 seconds, I believe, to 24, and tying Schism and Shadow Covenant into just pressing other buttons, and then giving Disc a 2-piece and a 4-piece that effectively incentivizes or even forces Discs to just spam Smite as many times as possible, and then press one button and then keep spamming Smite, is really boring. It's made the spec feel extremely shallow, unfortunately, and not being able to really contribute much to groups because I don't have a kick, and I don't have stops, and I don't have stuns, I don't have knocks, I don't have good mobility or good utility. Unfortunately, it's going to sound a little weird to say, but Discipline feels great because it can atonement heal, but it also feels so boring that I can't do more than one key at a time without logging over to a different character. All of the rotational depth that the spec had is gone. All of the active abilities that you really had to try and choose when to use or set up for your big atonement healing kind of burst windows have just been turned into passives tied to abilities that you always want to press on cooldown. And the talent options that used to reward some level of skill expression, like Twilight Equilibrium as a capstone, are now defunct, useless. No one even takes them anymore. Unfortunately, also all the talent builds play the same. Disc has become a little bit of the poster child in my mind of how talents should not be done. Talents are supposed to be options, and there is supposed to be some variation. But unfortunately, at the moment, Discipline really has to play all the same way. So much power for Discipline has been baked into the passives of Schism, Shadow Covenant, Void Summoner, Inescapable Torment, Mindbender, the 2-piece bonus, the 4-piece bonus, and how synergistic all of those abilities and talents are together, that all of these talents aren't options. You can't not take Schism or Shadow Covenant. There is no other talent options. Because of the way Disc has to play, these are just permanently locked in talents. The only real choice Disc has right now is to take Uppies or not, and to take Harsh Discipline or not. And then maybe you either take Divine Aegis or you go into Wheel and Woe. You take Aegis of Wrath or you drop something else. But again, because Disc always plays the same way, the talent setups you pick don't change the way you play the game. You're always effectively just pressing Penance on cooldown, Power Word Shield, Mind Blast, and Shadow Word Death all on cooldown, and then filling in all your empty globals with Smite spam. That's it. Doesn't matter if you have Wheel and Woe or not. Doesn't matter if you have Aegis of Wrath or not. Doesn't matter if you have Uppies or Harsh Discipline or not. You always press the same buttons and play the same way. So, funnily enough, I think Disc is simultaneously in one of the best states it's ever been in because you can atonement heal your way through so many things, and that is fun. applying your atonements, pressing penance and seeing health bars move up is enjoyable, but at the same time, the way it plays right now is just so mind-numbing. Like I said, to make this even worse though, there is no other part of the spec that can give it any depth. I don't have a kick. I don't have any good utility. I don't have a knockback or stops or stuns or blinds or anything. I can fear, maybe. In some situations, if I want to run into melee, I can use roots sometimes. But in almost every key, I find myself feeling like an NPC. I can't really contribute to the group in many of the ways that matter, especially as I'm pushing into higher keys and kicks and stops and coordinating group utility becomes more of a factor. As a Discipline Priest, I feel like I can't do any of those things. I don't have Bop or Freedom or Rescue or Tiger's Lust or anything to help my group contribute to actually playing the dungeon. But I will say it wasn't that apparent until I really started playing a couple of different ults. Because on other healers, I found myself playing the dungeon. I was thinking about which mobs I'm going to kick or which priority casts I'm going to kick, which abilities I'm looking to stun or knock, and I find that really fun. But on Discipline Priest and Holy Priest, I play the spec. I don't play the dungeon. Whether I'm in a Blackrook hold or an Everbloom or like literally any dungeon, Throat of Tides, doesn't matter. Disc and Holy play the same all the time because I'm not really playing the dungeon. I'm not playing against mobs or stopping casts or anything like that. I'm just pressing penance, Power Word Shield, Shadow Word Death, Radiance, over and over again. Right now, I think the Disc and Holy Priest not having a kick or really any good utility is flying under the radar a little because the meta tanks are Prot Pally and Demon Hunter with like Sigil of Silence and Avenger's Shield and a whole bunch of utility that they can bring or like mob control that they bring to a key. So that playing a disc when you're with a Vengeance Demon Hunter doesn't feel that bad because they can silence and kick and stop and stun and grip so many casts or so many abilities that not having those things as a healer doesn't feel that bad balance-wise. Still feels terrible to sign up to a group and contribute in no way to actually timing the key. On to Preservation. I've been playing Preservation because in my opinion it's the most challenging healer. It's definitely the highest skill expression healer in the game, in keys especially at the moment, and I don't think it's like a close race either. I think Preservation is way harder to play at the highest level than any other healer. So that is fun sometimes, but it's also frustrating sometimes. And it can be a little difficult for me to articulate any problems that the spec may have because every time I fail to heal a key or a boss or something goes wrong, I can always very quickly think about the ways I could have played much better. If I just used this ability at this time, or if I just set up 4 echoes instead of 3, or if I just had better positioning, it would have been okay. It's the spec that feels like I have all of the tools I need to succeed, but sometimes I or my group isn't good enough to pull that off. Damage feels decent. Utility and toolkit of Evoker is great in my opinion. Healing throughput is also quite good, but it is conditional, specifically on positioning. I've thrown in the towel a couple of times on Preservation in that I won't play them in pugs because not having the usual range that everyone is used to when healing is a little like just asking to deplete a key. As an example, I've had Dawn of the Infinite, Fall, I think it's Fall of Galakron keys, where the entire group stays together in the right, fast and slow zones for the Time Waste boss. And that's made Preservation with things like Emerald Communion, just running around, my whole group standing next to me, feels OP. Like I can get through mechanics that I can stress out on my other healers on, and I can just press one button on my Evoker and everything's fine. But then the same fight with a different group could go very differently if, let's say, both Chronofade targets are never in the same fast zone. And the whole group always feels like it's always 100 yards apart and everyone's all over the place on that boss fight. There are a couple of other boss fights like it where positioning just becomes way more of an issue than I thought it would have been or that I noticed on other healers. Even in the trio boss in Everbloom, I oftentimes have the entire group just run in very different directions to all drop their poison novas on the ground, which can make healing those fights very difficult or very stressful. So again, Preservation is one of those healers now that I just don't really want to pug with, because positioning is so important, but I also have such little control over it. Like I said before, as far as mana goes for Preservation, it's in a little bit of a weird spot. I've been playing a non-temporal anomaly build, and mana is a complete non-issue. I don't think I ever drop below 80 or 90% mana, no matter what I do or what I press. But I do know if I start playing a TA build and just press TA on cooldown, I'll run myself quite quickly. Having one spell be the difference between going and having infinite mana, or what feels like infinite mana, seems like pretty bad design and feels horrible. Paladins kind of know how that feels at the moment because they're in the same boat, but instead of it just being one spell that you avoid pressing, it's all of the spells that deal damage in your toolkit basically. As far as the other healers go, I've done a handful of keys and I've started gearing up my Holy Paladin, Resto Shaman, Resto Druid for the rest of the season. My plan is to focus on 3 or 4 healers to push with, see how I go, see how far I can pug, but I'm also going to be getting a decent amount of experience on all of the healers, including the ones I personally dislike, even if they're really powerful, like Resto Druid right now. Resto Druids feel numerically overpowered, and they're getting a buff next reset, I think of 3%, which is interesting. Even mine, with absolutely trash gear, healing throughput still feels like very high, but I personally dislike cat weaving, so Resto Druid's never really been the healer that's appealed to me that much. I remember talking in beta, made a video talking about how Resto Druid becomes much more my style, or much more enjoyable to play with 4-piece, because so much healing can be handled with just Life Bloom, Regrowth and Trees, and I am basically just doing vaults on my druid until I can switch to that style, until I can get 4-piece and I can get the lion's share of my healing in keys done with just 3 buttons in a non-pure hot or ramping style, just Life Bloom, Regrowth and little Grove Guardian dudes. So I'm looking forward to that. If Prop Paladin becomes the meta tank, I can definitely see Resto Druid being the meta healer. It's that good, or at least it feels that good, it seems that good. Their damage is getting nerfed next reset a little bit, and I still think it's going to be quite high. It's still going to be good. Their toolkit is fantastic, obviously bringing Mark of the Wild to your group in a meta where Guardians are no longer the best tanks. Having the healer bring 3% verse buff to your whole group along with the rest of the utility that Druid brings, like Stampeding Roar, Ursol's Vortex, Bash and Clone and so on, it's going to be really good. Holy Paladin, Restoration Shaman and Holy Priest all, in my estimation, feel noticeably weaker than Discipline and Mistweaver. Resto Shaman feels probably the best out of those 3 though, but unfortunately all 3 of those specs feel like they're just weaker or maybe equal versions of their former iterations, like Season 1 and 2 versions of their specs, which makes me a little less inclined to play them. Holy Paladin in particular is in a bit of a rough state as far as gameplay goes. I think numerically they aren't, catastrophically bad or that far behind. They could use some small buffs, but as far as gameplay goes at the moment, they're in the toilet. Their mana economy is currently so bad that I feel like pressing any button that deals damage runs me out of mana very quickly, and so I'm left ignoring like 60 or 70% of my toolkit, and I just sit there pressing Holy Shock, Infusion of Light procs, and then using those procs on Flash of Lights with the talent that makes them cost 0 mana. So the spec works, but I mean it's up there with Discipline as far as boredom goes. It's a little sad seeing a specialization that so recently felt so good be in such a terrible state. Holy Paladin has a good toolkit, a vast toolkit, and their mana and the balancing on a couple of their spells has been so bad that their toolkit has effectively been reduced to spamming like 2 or 3 buttons, and that feels terrible. Holy Paladin now feels a little bit like it's in the same spot that Mistweaver was in prior to 10.2, where Blizzard were kind of trying to fit A lot of different things in the same talent tree in the same spec. They're trying to, for Holy Paladins at least, they're trying to fit builders, spenders, melee abilities, casted spells all together, but they haven't quite got the flow and the numbers right to make the spec feel good. I think they did previously, but the spec has been nerfed so much now and the mana is so bad and there's a lot of problems with it numerically that the spec just doesn't really work or flow well anymore. I remember making a video back in Season 1 where I was talking about how Paladin felt really good when cooldowns were up, but when cooldowns were down, it felt a little anemic, a little weak. And I think because the spec has been nerfed so much in the past few months, I think it's been nerfed by 30% overall over the past 3 months or 4 months, which is kind of insane to think about how powerful the spec used to be when it was first released. Now, I know it was too strong, but now it's too weak because now it feels like the same as Season 1, where when I have my cooldowns rolling, when I have Wings Up, Tears Deliverance is running, and I'm getting ready to press, or I have Divine Plea or Divine Toll available, the spec feels great. But when I don't have those cooldowns running and when I don't have cooldowns ready to press, the spec feels terrible because the non-cooldown rotational throughput is so low that I feel like I can only really move health bars when I've pushed other buttons to set myself up beforehand, and those buttons aren't always available. I can't always have Tears Deliverance running, even though that would be really nice. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I'm planning to get back into YouTube and WoW in a more concerted fashion. So I'm planning on having a video out every week just talking about what I'm playing, how I'm feeling, what the healing specs in particular are feeling good or bad. And we'll see how we go for the rest of the season. Thanks for watching and algorithm stuff.